And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write the words of the first and the last who died and came to life. I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and the slander of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested. And for 10 days you will have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, Polycarp was born in 69 AD, just before the destruction of Jerusalem, and so well within the lifetime of some who would have been eyewitnesses of Jesus. He was a disciple of the Apostle John, a friend of Ignatius of Antioch, and a mentor to Irenaeus. For the second half of his life, he served as the bishop of Smyrna. And in the mid-2nd century, he died a martyr's death at the age of 86. His is one of the more famous accounts of persecution that led to martyrdom in the early church. And you can read about it in a document called the Martyrdom of Polycarp. Towards the end of his life, Polycarp had refused to burn incense to the Caesar and was therefore given over to the Roman authorities. It's written that he was brought into a crowded arena where he was to be threatened with the prospect of being thrown to the lions. The dialogue between him and the Roman governor went like this. Simply swear by Caesar, the governor pled. I am a Christian, said Polycarp. If you want to know what that is, set a day and listen. Persuade the people, answered the governor. Polycarp said, I would explain to you, but not to them. Then I'll throw you to the beasts, said the governor. Bring on your beasts, said Polycarp. If you score in the beasts, I'll have you burned, said the governor. You try to frighten me with the fire that burns for an hour, and you forget the fire of hell that never goes out, Polycarp replied. After this dialogue, Polycarp prayed that his death would be an acceptable sacrifice to God. Then he was burned alive at the stake. While Polycarp's was certainly a very dramatic instance of martyrdom, it definitely wasn't an isolated one. Throughout the first few centuries of the church, persecution, sometimes leading to death, was not uncommon. And it's precisely that kind of threat that the church of Smyrna was already facing several years before Polycarp's death, as John wrote these 7 letters in Revelation. So we're continuing our series in the 7 letters to the 7 churches in the book of Revelation with the 2nd letter today. And we saw last week that Jesus was addressing an Ephesian church that was really good at doing all the right things and watching their doctrine closely, and yet they had a love problem. Apparently, their genuine affection towards God and towards other human beings had grown cold. Therefore, Jesus had to urge them to repent, or else he would have to remove their lampstand, which symbolized their witness to the world. So that was the first letter. But today, we're looking at the 2nd letter, the letter to the church of Smyrna. And Jesus has a very different kind of message for this church. While Jesus is acting as a judge in these letters, he finds nothing about Smyrna that is worthy of critique or rebuke. Instead, this is a church that is suffering faithfully and therefore needs to be encouraged to simply press on. So the main question that this letter answers for us today is this. What does it look like for a church to remain faithful in the midst of hardship and persecution? And we'll see the answer to that question in 2 parts, which will be the 2 parts of our outline today, which is in your bulletin. Number 1, the hostility of the world, and number 2, the faithfulness of the saints. So we can first of all see the hostility of the world in Smyrna's context, starting right in verse 9. Verse 9 says again, I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and the slander of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Right off the bat, Jesus acknowledges the fact that Smyrna is going through a time of tribulation, of intense hardship. And that hardship is not just accidental. It's a hardship that's brought on by slander and persecution from those outside of the church. So it's in this letter to Smyrna that we see the first real indication of the fraught situation that Christians faced towards the end of the first century. In the early days of Christianity, Christians weren't merely mocked and scoffed at, they were sometimes violently pursued, because the populations they found themselves in the midst of, felt threatened by their presence. It can be easy for us to forget that Christianity started out as kind of an offshoot of Judaism, at least from an outsider's perspective. And therefore, Christians were in the minority, wherever they went for many, many years. And much of the Jewish population believed that Christianity was abhorrent and even blasphemous. Christians were looked on as those strange people who shared their scriptures and yet claimed that a man named Jesus was the Son of God, in addition to God the Father. So while Christians kind of flew under the radar in the first several years of the church in regards to the Roman Empire, they were often despised and looked at with suspicion by their Jewish neighbors. Now, it would be inaccurate to say that most devout Jews were violently opposed to the Christians. But what is true is that most of the persecution against the church in the first few years came from the synagogue and not from the state. Well, that's something that you can already see starting in the book of Acts. The first Christian martyr is Stephen, who is stoned to death by a group of Jewish leaders. And right after that, Luke tells us that a great persecution broke out against the church, causing many Christians to flee from Jerusalem. So from that moment on, especially within the first few centuries of Christianity, believers in Jesus could never be completely comfortable living in the world. And just as the Apostle Peter would write, we are like sojourners and strangers within this fallen world. And so what seems to be happening in Smyrna at this time is that certain Jews are seeking to slander the Christian church, perhaps by lodging false accusations against it, which has caused it to become impoverished. Now, before we move on to the next verse, it's important to note that neither Jesus nor John, who are both Jewish, are being anti-Semitic here. Sometimes liberal scholars and folks who are critical of the Bible will say that many of the early Christians, John included, were anti-Semites, that they hated Jews and never passed up an opportunity to disparage them. But anyone who has carefully read the New Testament knows that hatred towards the Jews is not at all what is being communicated. It's true that Jesus and the apostles wanted people to come out of Judaism as such, but they did not think that ethnically Jewish people should have to forsake their ethnic identity. They needed to forsake all the accretions that had been added to the Old Testament, but they did not need to forsake their identity. Therefore, whenever John or anyone else in the New Testament talks about the Jews in a negative way, they're always referring to those who both forsake Jesus and actively seek to pursue Christians. It's never meant to be a blanket statement that covers over every single Jewish person. But when certain Jews do that, they're doing the work of the enemy, which is why Jesus refers to some of those in Smyrna as a synagogue of Satan. It wasn't as if actual Satan worship was going on there. Rather, those particular Jewish people were in an adversarial role towards Christians. And of course, the name Satan means adversary or accuser. So the synagogue of Smyrna had become satanic in that sense. But there's even more to the satanic opposition to the church than mere slander or disrepute, which we see there in verse 10. So verse 10 says again, "Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation." Now, being thrown into prison was not really something that the Jewish leaders had the authority to do. So what lies beneath the surface here is an allusion to another adversary of the church, the Roman authorities. Now, as I've noted, the Romans weren't normally out looking for Christians to persecute, especially not early on. As long as they kept to themselves, the Romans couldn't have cared less what the Christians did. But there was one thing that the Romans required of all citizens of the empire. As we saw in the episode of Polycarp, they were required to burn incense in honor of the emperor. The Caesar thought of himself as a god, and therefore expected his subjects to pay him the proper respects. But of course, the Christians rightly saw that as idolatry and tried as best they could to abstain from it. The Jews had an understanding with Rome that they would assent to burn incense to the emperor, but they would only do so in acknowledgement of his rulership and not acknowledgement of his divinity. So perhaps there were Jewish people in Smyrna who really wanted to stick it to the Christians. So they ratted them out to the Roman authorities and told them that some of their subjects were refusing to pay their respects to the Caesar. And so some of the Christians would be apprehended and thrown into prison. And others might even pay a steeper price than that. So the Jews and the Romans are certainly the human actors in these acts and threats of persecution. But notice that Jesus names the devil as the one who will throw some of them into prison. Now, Jesus probably isn't saying that the devil himself will come and throw them into prison, but rather that the devil is ultimately the one behind all of the various persecutions that are going on. Satan is the spiritual reality behind the fallen earthly realities. Now, of course, sinful human beings have all the impetus within themselves to do horrible things. But if Satan sees a golden opportunity to oppress some of God's people, then he's going to come alongside those earthly persecutors and give them an extra nudge in the direction he wants them to go. So that was the situation of the Christians in first century Smyrna. But how does that apply to us today? Well, we too live in a fallen world, and therefore we also find ourselves being tried and tested in many different ways. But let's be honest, most of the hardship that the church in America experiences doesn't have anything to do with violent persecution. And sometimes that word is used too readily. Perhaps most of the American church's hardships today have to do with being in a culture that is quite indifferent to religion. Contrary to a lot of the vitriol that we can see on the internet, most of Western society actually operates in kind of a live and let live mentality. And so when the gospel is presented or when an invitation to church is extended to a stranger, the response is often that of quiet refusal. You can have your religion if that's what you're into, but it's not for me. And when you get enough people that think that way within one nation, then that nation's church attendance will inevitably plummet. But of course, hardship isn't something that merely affects us as Christians on a corporate or organizational level. It affects everyone on an individual level. It is impossible to spend any time in this world without experiencing hardship. And some Christians get discouraged by that because they assume that everything in life should be going well if they're doing the right thing and following God. But if they lose a job or have a death in the family or become ill, they wonder if God is punishing them for something. But one of the things that the letter to Smyrna teaches us is that even if a church and individuals within a church are doing the right thing, they can still suffer various forms of hardship. Amen. Faithful Christians are not immune from the fallenness of the world. As a matter of fact, suffering hardship and even persecution can sometimes be a sign that you are being faithful. And even though we in the American church are fairly insulated from violent persecution, there are many areas of the world in which churches do not enjoy that kind of comfort. Persecution is most certainly not a thing of the past. More Christians have died for their faith within the past 100 years than any other 100-year period in history. Intense persecution still exists in places like North Korea and Afghanistan and certain parts of North Africa. And in many other areas of the world, Christians experience a somewhat lighter form of persecution in the form of discrimination and slander, but it is persecution nonetheless. And while I don't want to sound doomsdayish, we should never discount the possibility that the kind of intense persecution happening in certain areas of the world could never happen here. We should never become too comfortable and therefore complacent. We should never go out looking for persecution, but we should not be surprised or think that God himself is against us if it does come. Well, moving on now to our second point today, we can see that the church in Smyrna is indeed standing strong in the midst of hardship. They are being faithful saints. And that little parenthetical remark there in verse 9 already tells us everything that we need to know about this church. Jesus says again in verse 9, I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich. Jesus is telling them that despite their material poverty, they are spiritually prosperous. They are overflowing with spiritual qualities, which are allowing them to stand strong, to endure. And while we're not given a whole lot of detail in the text regarding those spiritual qualities, I think that we can surmise at least a couple things. Number one, they are not meeting hatred and violence with hatred and violence of their own. They're being discriminated against and slandered, but they're not out there doing the same things to the Jews and the pagans. And if they're not doing that, then they're certainly not trying to have their own way through physical force. Even if they get arrested and thrown in jail, they're not going to retaliate. What's troubling nowadays is there's a certain contingency of Christians, mostly in America, who think that the time of being non-aggressive and non-violent towards the wider society is no longer something that we should hold to. And many of those so-called Christians are quite vocal about their beliefs, even beliefs that are outright hateful and not really in line with the teachings of Jesus. And then you have some of those, admittedly a minority, but still plenty, who think it's time to take up arms in order to fight for Christian values and Christian politics. Whenever I hear of such people, I always wonder if they've ever actually read the New Testament. That was not the mentality of the early Christian church, and it should not be our mentality today. Well, the second quality that the church in Smyrna seemed to have in spades was steadfastness, or perhaps we could call it faithful endurance. And that doesn't simply mean that they found a way to survive with all the hardships that were being thrown their way, though it includes that. Jesus tells them to be faithful even unto death. In other words, their endurance was not primarily a matter of physical survival, but of spiritual survival. Despite the pressure that they were probably felt so hard, they would not bow the knee to Caesar to appease the Romans. Nor would they renounce their conviction that Jesus was the Son of God in order to appease their Jewish neighbors. No, they were going to stand firm in their convictions, even if doing so led to death. So because the church at Smyrna exhibited those qualities and more, Jesus proclaimed them to be spiritually rich. But while everything that has been said so far has been very important, it really isn't until we get to the last part of verse 10 that we clearly see the main theme of this letter to Smyrna. So Jesus says again in the last part of verse 10, be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. The primary theme of this letter is the relationship between death and life, and in that order. Usually when you hear those two words listed, it's life and death. But here we see how different is the logic of God's kingdom. Death comes before life. It is only by passing through death that we are crowned with life. Yet that doesn't take away from the fact that death is a frightful and even unnatural thing. When Adam and Eve took from the forbidden tree, they were immediately marked with death. Not only spiritual death, but also eventual physical death of their bodies. And ever since then, death has been the great, unavoidable enemy of every human being. Death is a part of the curse. It was not a part of God's original design for human existence. Therefore, whenever we come into contact with death, or we ourselves face the prospect of our own death, we are naturally revolted by it. Barring some great physical pain or illness, no one in their right mind ever wants to die. We all intuitively feel that life should never end. And that's why when a loved one dies, it hurts so much. Experiencing the death of another person feels strange and unnatural because it is unnatural. God never meant for us to die. And which is why it's a natural human response to be revolted by death and to avoid even thinking about our own death. But now there are some within our society who take that natural aversion to death and exaggerate their perceived ability to delay or even to cheat death. Life longevity has turned into an industry unto itself. To cite just one example, there's a tech millionaire, maybe a billionaire, I don't know, named Brian Johnson, whose expressed mission statement for his life is, "Don't die." He's on social media and he has all kinds of followers. And he has said that he's kind of a human guinea pig for various experimental drugs, dieting regimens, workout routines, and any other kind of practice that might extend his life expectancy. And while he doesn't seem certain that he himself will live forever, he thinks that humanity will eventually advance to a stage where natural death is no more. Now, Johnson is not a religious believer. At best, he's probably an agnostic. And so for him, human beings have to literally take their lives into their own hands because he believes there's no God that's going to do that for them. Now, there's nothing wrong with wanting to extend your life expectancy by a few years. But I think that we can all see just how ridiculous and ultimately sad such a philosophy like that is. The now former New York Times columnist Ross Douthat had Johnson on his podcast a couple weeks ago. And as Douthat interviewed him, he challenged Johnson's assumption that death is always necessarily a thing to be avoided. Johnson said that he thinks that there will come a day when we put the idea of a good death behind us as something passé, something that the human race had to suffer for millions of years, but then will enjoy the fruit of medicalized immortality. But Douthat, who is a Christian, rightly corrected Johnson at that point. He said that death in and of itself is not a good thing, but being willing to die is a good thing, especially if you're willing to die for another person. So bringing this back to the letter of Smyrna, Jesus is not telling them that physical death itself is a good thing. He's not telling them to rush out there and just get themselves killed. No, he's saying that they should remain faithful even if that means having to suffer and die for their faith. If their choice is between renouncing the lordship of Jesus or being crucified, then they should choose the cross every time. Because unlike people like Brian Johnson, Christians believe that, number one, there is a God. And number two, God has promised us that there is more than just this life. If you're an atheist or a materialist, then it makes sense to be very anxious about extending your human existence right now, because there's nothing else to look forward to. It's all up to you to have just the right intake of calories and to drink the protein shakes and to do the workout routine and to do all the right natural supplements. But the thing is, even if someone like Brian Johnson was able to extend his life by a certain number of years, let's say 50 years, he is still eventually going to die. And we could even hypothetically grant that in, say, 100 years from now, AI will help us discover how to extend human life indefinitely. No more death from natural illness or old age. Well, that still doesn't prevent a person from stepping out into the street and being hit by a bus and killed that way. In other words, death is inescapable. And any idea that we as human beings in our own power can somehow cheat death is simply an exercise in delusion and pride. And what that realization does is it allows us to loosen our grip on our own lives, on trying to live forever, and to simply rest in God's care. The day and the hour of your death is already determined. It won't take God by surprise. So we can rest assured that He will keep and protect us until that time, and even beyond that time. Because as we can see right here in this letter, believers do not think that this earthly existence is all that there is. I'll start at the end of verse 10 and read through verse 11. Jesus says, "Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death." From this, we can gather that every human being has an earthly life and an earthly death. But after death, some enjoy an afterlife, and others experience a second death. So there are two kinds of life and two kinds of death. Everyone experiences the earthly life, but not everyone experiences eternal life with God, the crown of life that Jesus is talking about here. But those who do not endure faithfully to the end, those who forsake Jesus or who had never come to Jesus in the first place, they continue to exist, but their existence can't really be described as a life. Instead, they suffer a second death, which this book tells us later on is the lake of fire. So what Jesus is telling the Smyrna church and all of us is to follow in the way of Jesus, which for some will be the way of the cross. And even if it's not a literal cross or a literal martyr's death that awaits us, we are called to suffer faithfully in this life and to at least be willing to die for our allegiance to Jesus. And if you want to know what faithful suffering looks like, just read the four Gospels. Read those accounts of Jesus' life and death. And after that, read about the stoning of Stephen in Acts chapter 7, or the many different times they attempted to kill Paul in that same book. After you've read those accounts of the New Testament, look up those historical accounts of the martyrs of the early church. Read about Polycarp and Perpetua and Justin and Ignatius. Because of that kind of faithfulness unto death, the Christian church spread like wildfire throughout the known world in the first few centuries. And that's counterintuitive. You would expect the threat of death to keep people away from the church. But as the great church father Tertullian once said, the more you mow us down, the more we grow. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. Being a Christian isn't a hobby or just something that we do on a Sunday morning. It's a giving of your full self to God by following in the footsteps of Jesus Christ. And when we do that, we become witnesses, bright, shining lights in this dark world. The Greek word martus, from which we get our word martyr, means witness. And what do the martyrs witness to? What are they a testimony of? Well, they're witnesses to the fact that God does not deal with the world in the way that we might want to deal with it, with a show of force, with hateful rhetoric, maybe even bombs and guns. No, instead of choosing hate and violence toward the world, Jesus chose the cross. And by choosing the cross, he became victorious over sin, Satan, and death. He became an overcomer. And in doing so, he set the example for how all of those who follow him are to be overcomers. The crown that Jesus promises those who endure faithfully is a victor's crown. It's the kind of crown that someone would get after successfully competing in an athletic competition. And of course, the crown is but one more way that Jesus describes a reward of eternal life with God. That's what every Christian should long for. So may we all, when we look towards our own death, be able to say what the Apostle Paul once said in his second letter to Timothy. He wrote this, "For I am already being poured out like a drink offering, and the time for my departure is near. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Now there is in store for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only me, but also to all who have longed for his appearing."